And I am going to introduce Bishop William Nolan, who is going to speak about where is God in all of this. And Bishop William Nolan, so you have an act here to follow, is the Bishop of Galloway, and here today in his capacity as President of Justice and Peace National Commission, which is a commission of the Bishops' Conference of Scotland. The National Commission campaigns on matters relating to social justice, international peace and human rights, and promotes action in these areas. And since joining the commission as president 6 years ago, Bishop Nolan has given selflessly of his time, involving himself in each of the campaigns the commission has undertaken, and he's been very active around the rights of refugees and migrants, joining in peaceful protests to help them. So thank you, Bishop. We really appreciate you being here today, and I'll turn the mic over to you.
I spent most of the 1980s in Rome. Now, many of you here will remember the 1980s. It worries me that people here maybe don't remember the 1980s because it wasn't that long ago, really. So it's not ancient history. And at that stage, environmental issues were just beginning to come to the surface, but it was early days. I remember, for instance, that the Scandinavian countries were complaining about the acid rain that was falling on them coming from British power stations, and Britain just kind of shrugged its shoulders and said, "What acid rain? Nothing to do with us." You know, it seemed as though one of the issues were coming to the fore, people were getting an awareness of what we're doing to the earth, and it didn't seem as though it was ever going to be resolved because of the kind of nationalistic attitudes that people had, because to resolve those issues, the whole world really had to come together to resolve them. I mentioned that I was in Rome because I went to Rome in 1983, and at that time they were talking about the next Synod of Bishops and what that Synod of Bishops was going to be about. And one of the possibilities mentioned at that stage was that Synod of Bishops might be about the environment. Now, in actual fact, it wasn't. They chose to have the Synod of Bishops about reconciliation, about confession, which I thought, well, I didn't see the point of that really, because Paul VI had produced a perfectly good document of reconciliation 10 years previously. And I often felt what a missed opportunity we had. At the very start, when the Green Movement was beginning to grow, if the Catholic Church had done a Synod of Bishops about the environment and brought out some kind of statement, then we would have been involved over the next 30 years as that movement began to grow. Instead, what happened was that the Church was not involved. God had no place in these environmental issues as far as most people were concerned. Not only had the Church nothing to say about it, but nobody expected the Church would have anything to say about it, that God had anything at all to do with the environment. Until we get, of course, to the Laudato Si in 2015, the Pope's encyclical. But really, that brought the Church right to the fore of that issue. Now, that isn't actually entirely true. If you want to move on to the first slide. When you look back, way back to 1971, you've got this quote there from Pope Paul VI in one of his encyclicals, where he says, "By no considered exploitation of nature, humanity risks destroying it." Quite a strong statement from the Pope. Okay, and then Francis, you move on to the next slide. Pope John Paul II, the one that chose not to have a synod on the environment, he also had a couple of quotes from one of his encyclicals in 1991. You know, he talks about the senseless destruction of the natural environment, and then he says, "Nature is more tyrannized than governed by humanity." A very strong statement indeed. But those statements are just a couple of lines in an encyclical that's maybe 100 pages long. And I don't think anyone would have thought that John Paul II had said anything about the environment at all, or the Church had anything to do with it, until really we get to Laudato Si and what Pope Francis has to say there. Now, Pope Francis, as I say, has brought the Church into the limelight. People now recognise that the Church does have something to say, that God does have a place. And Pope Francis is in great demand. We know he's not coming COP now, but everyone wanted him to come. I got a phone call from a group of scientists 2 years ago asking me to use my influence to get the Pope to come to COP. Very flattering, they thought I had any influence at all on that happening, but that's a group of scientists who were keen for the Pope to come. And of course, the Pope was coming. The British government had invited the Pope to come. Boris Johnson invited the Pope to come. So even the British government were very keen that the Pope should come forward. And many people think that Laudato Si, published just before the COP in 2015, had a great influence in that, and that it helped galvanise people's views. So now things have changed to some extent, in that we recognise that this is an issue, a theological issue. It's not just an issue about the climate that you can just kind of leave to scientists. This is another issue. And the Pope points out, of course, that it's not just an environmental crisis we face, it's a social crisis. It's not just environmental justice, but social justice for others. And we've heard how everything is so interconnected together. The one thing relates to the other. And that's definitely very, very true. But I'm not entirely convinced that even within the Church, that despite the fact that Pope Francis is a leading light now in the environmental movement, that everyone is convinced that the Church should have anything to do with that at all. You still get that kind of feeling that some people think that Pope Francis had got better things to do with his time, really, than care about the environment. And we don't see that interconnectedness of it all. Interestingly, the Scottish bishops put out a pastoral letter, as you know, in Pentecost, and one of the things that it mentions is, it says, we've been destroying the earth. And when that pastoral letter went out for consultation beforehand, a couple of the comments that came in says, oh, that language is very exaggerated. We shouldn't really be saying it's destroying the earth. And it was interesting because at that stage I could go back to what Pope John Paul II has said about the nature being more tyrannised and governed by humanity. But I don't think we've quite got the grasp of it, even within the Church itself, that this is an issue and that God has got a place in this issue. What I think Laudato Si brought to this, and what faith brings to this, and what the Church brings to this, and what God brings to this, is a change of language. So we're not talking about the climate or climate change, we're talking about creation. And once we start talking about creation, then that's a different language. We're talking about a gift from God that God has entrusted to humanity. And when you receive a gift, your first reaction is gratitude. That this is a gift, something you receive. You don't take it for granted because it's a gift. And tied in with that then is also the whole idea and understanding of stewardship. In the book of Genesis, God says to Adam and Eve to care for the earth. We are stewards of God's creation. And it's God's creation, it's not our creation. We do not possess it. It's not ours to do with as we please, but it's something we've been trusted with to look after and care for. And that attitude is very, very important, and it comes from the fact we see the place for God in this. That this is creation that God's entrusted to us, and we care for God's creation. It's not ours. We don't possess it. And we have that tendency in our human nature, a tendency of our fallen human nature to be possessive. It's mine. And what's mine I can do with as I please. Don't you tell me what to do with what's mine. It's my money, I can spend it the way I please. I'm sure we've all heard people saying that. Yet it's not ours to do with as we please. It is God's. And the other aspect of that, of course, is that this gift of creation is given by God to the whole of humanity. It's given by God for the benefit of everyone, not just of a few. And we tend to decide, well, this is my country and I happen to have lots of oil in the ground, so it's my oil, or and presume that and we restrict the use of those natural resources even to ourselves. Maybe oil is not a good example if I'm talking about the environment, but never mind. You know, but we act that way, and we don't see one of the issues that the Pope brings up, and has been mentioned by many popes before him, is the universal destination of goods. That is at the heart of church social teaching, but it's maybe something that many people have never heard of. You know, we hear all about private property and so on, but the universal destination of the goods of the earth comes before private property. These things are there for the benefit of everyone. And that shows how everything here is interconnected. It's God's creation given to humanity to care for as stewards and guardians of that creation, and the benefits are there for everyone. And the benefits are there to be passed on to others in future generations. So it's not right for us just to dig up what's there and use all those resources ourselves without a care for tomorrow. That's not on. That's not guardianship of creation. We have to pass things on to the next generation. We have to pass on to the next generation the great diversity. We've got to appreciate the diversity that God has given us and maintain that and pass on the diversity of creation onto a future generation as well. One of the great phrases that Pope Francis used in Laudato Si when he started talking about our common home. I think that's a wonderful phrase, because the earth is more than just soil, it's more than just sea and sky. This is not about caring for a material thing. This is about caring for our common home. And there's ethical and moral responsibilities there. And once again, it shows, it takes this issue into away from something that's purely just kind of scientific and into a theological issue as well, where God comes into it, because this is the common home that God has given us, and we share that home with others. And it helps to relate us also to the people, in some of these faraway Pacific islands, where they're just above sea level, and pretty soon they're going to be pretty below sea level. And we've heard about that for a long while, and yet we didn't really, don't talk for myself, never talk about anybody else, but really care too much about it. It doesn't affect us. Yet, what's that got to do with me? It's got to do with me because it's our common home, and I'm destroying that part of the home where some of my brothers and sisters lives. I think it's fair to say that it's only because we're beginning to see the effects of all the negative human activity on ourselves, on our own climate, and so on, that we really become concerned about it. When it was affecting other people in these faraway places, really, we didn't. We're concerned about air pollution here. My goodness, go to New Delhi and the air pollution there. We don't tend to be too concerned about that. But when it starts affecting ourselves, we do tend to be more concerned. But this is our common home, and therefore we have to preserve it, and that part of the common home where our brothers and sisters live. Now, the whole economic system that we have is all based on consumption. When was the last time a government referred to us as being citizens, but always referred to as consumers? What an absolute insult that we should be called consumers, as though our whole purpose in society was to consume, and yet our whole model of gross domestic product is all based on consumption. Governments want us to consume more so that the GDP goes up, and that's better. It's not. We know it's not better. So we need a whole new model, financial model, for how the world is run, because the present model is destructive of its very nature, because it depends on more and more consumption of the earth's goods, and we can't sustain it that way. But I think with God giving us this idea of creation, of the universal destination of goods, then we appreciate that that is wrong, and therefore this environmental issue is also an economic issue, and it's an issue of social justice. And we have to move away from this idea of possession and consumption. Now, another important aspect, I think, that our faith brings to this debate is, I think it brings hope. A lot of the stuff that you can see on the internet and so on about environmental change and climate change and so on is very apocalyptic. You know, the end of the world is nigh. When I grew up, there's always some of those cartoon characters, people going around with a boat, but they're still doing it. But our faith gives us hope, because what we see, the negative effects that we see in the environment are caused by our fallen human nature, our failings, our frailty, our selfishness. But we have been redeemed. We have been redeemed by God. Christ has died for us. The Spirit of God is active throughout the whole world. And that's what gives us the hope. Not looking around at our fellow human beings and thinking, oh my goodness, what a bunch they are. They won't save us. It's God's Spirit which is active in the world and active in the lives of so many people. And we see it because the very first step to conversion, I think Brian mentioned metanoia, which is a complete change of life, is to recognise that you're doing wrong. And it may well have taken us 40 years from the early 80s, I was talking about at the start, till today. But now we do recognise that we're doing wrong. That's the first stage of conversion. And we've got to see God's Holy Spirit active in that and bringing that about. Now, we see that hope because we see, for instance, just at the start of October, there was a meeting in Rome of scientists and religious leaders. There were 40 religious leaders from all kinds of religions, all coming together to make an appeal in advance of COP. And isn't that quite amazing to have all these different religions actually coming together? Is that not a movement of the Spirit, of God's Spirit working there? So God is there. You might want to go up the next slide, Francis. I can't remember what the next slide is now, but when I see it, I know what it is. Yes, and part of that appeal that they made at the end, signed by all these religious leaders, by the scientists, I thought it was very interesting because it says, we must address these challenges using the knowledge of science and the wisdom of religion to know more and to care more. And here we have this issue, which is bringing religion and science together, faith and science together, church leaders and scientists together. And given, over the last decades or so, we've just seen faith and religion, faith and science split up, and scientists not seeing any point in faith, and there being such a split between the two. Now we're seeing them coming together on this issue. Now God is very much involved in that. Francis. Now. So where is God at COP26? I think the Holy Spirit is there because the Holy Spirit is bringing humanity together. We weren't united in the 1980s, but now the whole of humanity is now focused on this issue. And that, I think, is the power of the Spirit. And our faith is challenging the self-interest which has got us into this situation in the first place. I think our faith also allows us to look more long-term than we're used to. Politics is very short-time business, but we look long-term because God has given this gift to us, and we've got to be able to pass it on to future generations. So it shows that link with the future as well. And very clearly, bringing God into this, it shows that we are, carers of creation, stewards of creation, and a term that John Paul II used was a cooperator with God in creation. This is a quote here from our pastoral letter at Pentecost, that God has honoured us by giving humanity the task of being a co-operator in the work of creation. And that's what we are. And our faith makes us appreciate that that's what we are. And that's the hope that we have. And we want to know where God will be at COP26. He'll be with everyone who says something or does something that doesn't destroy but enhances God's creation.